Hi, Patrick from Malaysia. This is a question for Malik. What are the avenues for people or citizens who are, in the event that government or agencies do not provide them the equality or are seen to be given the equality before or in the law? Oh, that's a question. What are the avenues for citizens, or what can they do if governments or agencies, judiciary, do not give them the equality of the law in the law?
I think that's really the problem, because the avenues for recourse are limited. You have to go to the courts, or you have to take it up with a government agency that's potentially going to ignore you unless you're super influential or you know someone. And that tension has developed over the years, that it's come to a point where you effectively have to make a lot of noise, create a lot of drama in order to see change. So it depends on how complex the problem is. If you're saying that you've been treated badly by a government agency in some house planning thing or something, you can go to the courts and get judicial review. And something like that shouldn't be a problem. But say you're complaining about something much bigger, something that has political ramifications, chances are the courts are not going to be quite keen to deal with it, or even if you win in first instance, it could be reversed in the Court of Appeal and so on. And that's been our experience. So what do you do in that kind of situation? Obviously, you have to find for those bigger problems, you have to find ways outside the traditional routes to highlight the problem and to try and create pressure of some form. I know that's a really vague answer, but really that's what it's come down to. And those two obvious points on the spectrum describe the issue as I see it.
Thank you. This is for Professor Lan. So I'm Taiwanese as well. So as you were making your presentation, I began to think a little bit whether or not you could see a silver lining in this kind of global parenting. Because what is going on in Taiwan is the ultimate question of inequality, in that there's China and then there's Taiwan. And Taiwan's trying to stay as Taiwan and stay independent, whereas this is perception that it's all one China, and so therefore we all need to belong together, kind of thing. So the silver lining that I'm looking for in this global parenting is whether or not the children who are coming out of this global parenting, while at this point may seem like there are problems with this inequality and social problems, in the long run might actually be very helpful for the future of Taiwan, in that they have a sense and they have a much larger global view as to what independence could possibly be. They would have seen a few more things. They would have seen the problems of difference. They would have seen discrimination. They would have seen a lot of things. And so my question is whether or not, if you take a longer horizon of your presentation, would there actually be a silver lining? Something positive that could come out of this?
There are actually a lot of positive things in what I described. And I actually, people often misunderstand that I think we should go back to the standardized exam system to achieve equality. No, that's not equality. That's some sort of fairness. That's probably not even a fairness. And we often confuse fairness with equality. So I actually, in support of the education reform, despite my critique of the implication of social inequality. And a lot of policy transformation I described in my talk, I think they started with very good intention. And it does produce positive outcome in many aspects, especially for middle-class children. What I'm just trying to say, we should think more carefully about the potential class bias in how we define, say, parental competency, how we reward children's talent and intelligence. And I think that's something we really need to pay careful attention. Otherwise, all these ideas become so universal and actually disguise and exacerbate class inequality.
This is Alex. I have a question for Richard. In your talk, you seem to have described countries, societies in Southeast Asia that appear to still put a lot of faith in the electoral systems, in the sense that you found from your studies the expectation that the electoral system and democracy is supposed to deliver equality. But of course, you have generalized each country. Number one, I'd like to know from you, do you think that this faith is misplaced? And number two, are there sub-communities in each of these countries where your research has found that these sub-communities don't share that generalized faith in the democratic or electoral process as an avenue to righting whatever inequalities these sub-communities face? At what point, and number three, at what point would a sub-community break out into non-democratic and non-electoral means based on your experience and research as an academic in this area? Thank you.
It's a difficult thing to say whether or not the faith in the election system is misplaced. I think it varies by country, and it also varies by where you're at in how you see it. I think no matter what, unfortunately, elections are one of the few mechanisms for some sort of transition that provides some sort of organized, peaceful means for that transition to take place. And if you compare elections to alternatives, which involve violence or even people out on the streets, I put my faith in elections, even recognizing their constraints. And I think if we take most of Southeast Asian countries, we can see that elections have brought about changes, not necessarily always positive ones, but they have brought about opening up in space in quite considerable ways. And that's part of why we see inequality being manipulated in particular ways and the systems being manipulated, because they're contested. And there are large sections of Southeast Asia where elections are quite competitive, Singapore being one of them, as well as Malaysia, Cambodia, Indonesia. I mean, this polarization that exists, and electoral partisan polarization is widespread across the region, in part because people think elections have a shot, or there is some option there. And I think that we have to be cognizant of that. But there are people who are disengaging, and I would put those disengagers in three sets of groups. The first of which are the cynics, the people, and some people call them the apathists or whatever, but people who don't want to register to vote and don't want to participate. Now in Singapore you don't necessarily have that option, but we see this in the voting registration rate. So for example, among young people in Malaysia, only 25% of them under the age of 25 have actually, who could vote, which is 4.2 million, have actually registered to vote. And that is a very shocking number, but it also indicates the fact that they couldn't be bothered. And there's a certain degree of sense that the system is not going to shift and change them. And this is true of a lot of young people across the region, in Indonesia and Cambodia, and even parts of Myanmar. We found that even though the elections did provide options. And then there's a second group of people, which are the political activists, and we could even call them the idealists. They think that elections is not the way to solve things. It's to go out and to do things like philanthropy or work that involves engaging with civil society in a more, what they would consider a more meaningful way. And we're seeing this real significant change. People are no longer joining political parties, they're joining civil society organizations across the region. The nature and the composition of social capital is shifting and changing. And this is quite exciting. So even in Thailand, where we have a military and government and no real elections on the prospect, and if they are going to be elections, they're probably not going to be fair ones, we're going to see a situation where, that was a bit of political commentary, sorry about that. But we have a situation where people are actually engaging in politics in everyday type of interactions. And so they're distancing themselves from electoral systems. And then there's a third group of people who want to have exit. And they are looking to, and the biggest concern for me is that number is increasing when the systems become unfair. When elections are no longer viable, they're no longer competitive, then more people turn to alternative means outside of the electoral process. And these are people who engage in terrorism, people who engage in other more violent options. And we do see this in the region, and it is a worrying trend. It's not as bad as it was in parts of the 70s in some parts of the region, Southeast Asia, but it is there, and it is a real one. I think I've answered some of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the presenters. Actually, I'm going back to the topic and the whole theme of this discussion. This is the great equalizer, whether it's election, whether it's parents, whether it's children, whatever. And therefore, my question is, when we look at the media, whether it is the normal mainstream media or whether we look at the social media, I wonder in the cases especially, thank you Bridget for your wonderful expense, whether that had played any part in all the scenarios or some of the scenarios that you painted. I'm sorry, I'm going to the other last speaker, the lady from Taiwan. Yes, I think it's very important, all that you have described, but I'm more interested in that. I am curious about all the institutional interference, etc., that you mapped out. Whether we all know about Malaysia and the social media. I wonder whether any of the mapping has taken place, whether social media is really moving things forward in spite of heavy corruption, if I can use that word. Thank you.
I think in some ways Cherian should be answering this question rather than I. But let me talk a little bit about the issues of social media and elections, and that I think that in certain elections, social media provided an equalizer. So we saw that in the 2008 election, for example, in Malaysia, where access to alternative sources really changed and transformed the political environment. But by 2013, that wasn't the case. The government controlled the social media space. And you had the evolution of echo chambers, which actually made social media less of an equalizer and more of a divider. And I think we found that pattern in Singapore to a certain degree in that versus 2011 to 2015. And we're seeing that shift and change in Indonesia as well. And my projection, it will also be a change in the context of the Cambodia election. But it has some media dimensions. Social media put Duterte in this position. His control and access compared to other candidates. So it is still a very powerful force, given the fact that social media allows more economically vulnerable populations access than some of the other areas. So I think it's a bit complex in my answers, so I'm saying that there's equalizing in some ways, in some context.